For today's bonus lesson, I wanted to give you guys just like a tiny little tidbit of a demo of basic rigging in After Effects, just to get you guys kind of at least aware of some of the basic ideas behind it. But I want to say right off the bat that rigging is a big, wide, deep subject. In fact, we're planning to do an intensive course for School of Motion, particularly focused on character rigging. And so this is really a subject that deserves a full course or even several of them. So I'm just going to kind of give you guys some basics just for fun, just because I'm sure some of you are getting curious as you work with the rigs in the class. As I mentioned before, even if you are not real familiar with rigging right off the bat, Duik does offer a very nice auto rig system, and the new version of Duik, which is going to be out by the time this course is public, Duik 15 is going to have several different auto rigs. And those can be used very easily without really learning a whole lot about the depths of rigging, and you'd be able to do a lot of great work just with those simple auto rig systems. But let's talk just a little bit about some basic rigging here. But to just give you guys a little overview, one of the things that I always like to kind of think about is what is the big idea or the big philosophy behind rigging? What are we doing? What's the point? And the whole point is to make the life of the animator easier, so that the animator can focus on the performance of the character as much as possible. Now that has to be balanced out between the massive amount of control that the animator wants. So the animator is demanding a high level of control, but simultaneously asking for a high degree of intuitive, fairly simple, well-organized controls that allow him or her once again to really focus on the important part of the job, making the character come to life. So a good rig should have some kind of basic organization. It should have hidden layers so that you can't click on or see in your timeline or on your in your comp window. You shouldn't see any of the guts. We use the shy button to hide the guts away, and we also lock layers so that the only thing that is clickable are the controllers themselves. Having as many controls as possible, reduced down to as few layers as possible. This makes the work of the animator easier, saves screen real estate, makes moving and copying keyframes easier. So all of those things are just kind of basic kind of rigging philosophies. And again, I can go into this in much more depth. Rigging is a particular love and passion of mine. Now, for this little bonus lesson, I'm just going to walk you guys through rigging up a simple arm. We're just going to do a very simple arm rig. But before we do that, I want to show you guys 3 different ways that limbs can be rigged and show you some of the pros and cons there, just so you're kind of aware of what's available out there. And what we're going to do is one of the simplest types of rigs for an arm, a really basic arm rig. But I wanted to show you some of the things that are possible. And just FYI, these are just a few of the things that are possible. But the first one we have here, which is an entirely puppet tool based rig. This is what we're going to build in our demo. And in this case, we have a single piece of artwork. The arm, upper, lower, and the hand and the fingers is all one single piece of art. And the whole thing has been puppet tooled using After Effects' puppet tool. If you're not familiar with the puppet tool, we're going to be kind of going through the basics in the demo here, but it basically allows you to deform artwork based around the position of pins that allow for sort of rotation points for the deformation. And again, we're going to walk through this. Hopefully most of you at least have had some experience with the puppet tool. So this rig has been created with the puppet tool on a single piece of artwork. And if I pick up and drag the controller, you see that it works very nicely. And the other thing that works really well here is that I get stretchiness. I get a stretchy rig, which is nice. Not always necessary, but it's definitely a nice thing to have for especially more broad cartoony characters. But I want to point out some of the cons of a puppet tool rig, and that is the elbow and the wrist, the actual joints. Notice how we're getting a kind of a pinching, and in a sense we're sort of losing volume right there. That's a really classic puppet tool thing. The puppet tool is a far from perfect tool, and it does some really kind of funky things, and it doesn't bend sharply very well. It'll do it, but it tends to kind of break down. You lose proportion. It often tends to kind of lose volume as the artwork kind of squeezes together. So you tend to not get the most crisp arms. Now, you may not want crisp arms, and as we go through the process of building this rig, I'm going to show you how you can actually let the arm be more like a rubber hose. And with some types of characters, that sort of soft, bendy rubber hose look is more appropriate. But I just want you guys to be aware, in that case, the puppet tool is exactly what you want. If you want that kind of soft, bendy rubber hose kind of arm, the puppet tool rig is 100% the best way to go. If you want a really tight, crisp joint that maintains a feeling of volume, and look at how that elbow also gets kind of pinched there. Now, this isn't bad at all. But with some more realistic artwork, this is a pretty stylized arm. If this arm was more realistic, that would start to get a little awkward and might cause some unpleasant deformations in the artwork. So, puppet tool, some pros, some cons, some nice things about it, but some things it doesn't do all that well. Next up, we have what's really kind of the old-fashioned way of doing joints, which is separate layers. So now we have a separate upper arm, separate forearm, and a separate hand layer. Now I have thrown some puppet tools on the hand layer, but for the most part this is three separate layers jointed together with standard anchor points and parenting, and then we added the Duik IK to it. So you can see that the big advantage here is look at how nice these joints are. Now, this also, getting joints this nice, also requires very careful planning as you create the artwork. You want to create these perfectly circular overlaps that will always look good at no matter what angle they're at. So the jointing has the big advantage of giving you very, very nice crisp joints that don't lose any volume. And, you know, clearly that is a far superior joint to that one there. Just visually, that just looks a whole lot better. So a big advantage there. That's something that you can definitely say. It's also a very easy rig to build. It's a very simple rig. The basic puppet tool rig isn't all that hard either, but this is a very simple one as well. But there are some drawbacks. One of the drawbacks is you don't have the option for stretchy IK here. So watch what happens when I go beyond the stretch point. Whoops. Okay, see the controller just stops. It just reaches its limit of ability to control that thing, and just ceases to be effective. So, and people say, oh, my rig is broken. It's not broken. That's just what it does if there's no stretchiness. The controller just moves out of its range of influence, and there's nothing more it can do. So that's the disadvantage of doing plain old joints. So plain old joints, they look great, easy to set up, no stretchiness. Now, in some cases, you have no need for stretchiness. And I would say if you're doing something that's more realistic, you might want to go this direction, because, or something that's very graphically precise where you need to really maintain the shapes very carefully, this would be a great way to go, but you are going to have to give up that stretchiness. So again, pros and cons. Now, neither of these is the way that dolly and ollie or squash and stretch are rigged. All four of those characters are rigged using a combination of the puppet tool and jointing the joints together. And I refer to this, and this is 100% just my term, and it's just a way to tell them apart. I call it a blended joint. So it is combining the advantages of a jointed layer rig with some of the advantages of the puppet tool rig. Now, the one thing that the blended joint won't do are those kind of soft rubber hose bends. For that, you really have to use the puppet tool. But if you want this kind of crispness in the joints and this attractive joints, but you still want some stretchiness, the blended joint gives you both. So here we have our nice, beautiful joints, but oh, look at that, it'll stretch. And that's again the way squash and stretch and dolly and ollie are rigged. Now, I'm not going to demo this because, quite frankly, this is a much more advanced rigging system. And I would argue strongly that until you kind of understand the basics with either a full puppet tool rig or a layer rig, jointed layer rig, you don't even want to try to get into this because it'll probably scramble your brain. Once you learn the basics, then this will start to make sense, and it's not that complicated. But I'm very good at rigging, and I still have to work very carefully and slowly through one of these blended joint rigs. But it's a very, very nice effect, and once again gives you kind of the best of both worlds. The only thing that this would not be good for is, again, a rubber hose if you wanted a soft curve to your joints rather than a nice crisp bend like an elbow or a knee. Those are the three kind of basic limb joint types that you can do. And what we're going to do is walk you through this basic puppet tool rig, just a really basic puppet tool rig. And this is one that in a lot of cases is the best way to go if you need something really fast, really quick, and you don't need a huge range of motion. So let's move over to the arm rig demo here and get started building this kind of very basic rig system. Now let's review what we've got here. We're starting with a single layer with the entire arm inside it. It's actually a pre-comp of the layers together. We're going to first start by applying puppet pins along the arm. And again, if you haven't used the puppet pin tool, I want to go over a couple basics here and just to get you guys oriented. What happens with the puppet pin is that it creates a warpable mesh that encloses your artwork. And this mesh is going to hug around the alpha channel of the artwork. Up here we have a few different settings. We have mesh show. This is usually defaulted to off. I recommend that you turn this on at least when you're getting started so you have a clear understanding of what's happening. The next little item here is expansion. This is the number of pixels that the mesh will expand beyond the artwork. I recommend keeping this set a little bit high. I usually just leave it at around 20 in most cases. You don't want it too tight. You don't need it to be crazy far, but somewhere between 10 and 20 is a good basic setting. I'm not going to go into all the details here, or else this would be a very long lesson indeed, but just let's just say between 10 and 20 on the expansion is a good idea. With the triangles, I usually keep those turned up all the way. The highest setting possible is 1500. Now, the high triangle count means you get a higher quality deformation. It's sort of like subdivisions or polygons in 3D. The more you have, the more smooth the deformation is. So I usually just keep that cranked up all the way unless you have an unusually slow machine. So when we set pins, we create this mesh that we talked about, and the pins become points at which the artwork will actually bend around. So wherever there is a pin, the artwork will bend and flex around that point. Now, puppet pins by themselves are a little bit useless, and we'll kind of see that as we go. They only have position value, but we're going to use Duik to kind of improve our situation. Oh, and let's switch to our rigging and animation setup here. Okay, so now we're ready to start putting our pins in. Because the pin points are where the artwork is going to bend, we want to put our pins on the joints of the arm. Let's start at the top. I'm going to select, and you can see I've got my anchor point set up there at the top of the shoulder, and I'm going to put my first pin basically right on top of that anchor point. It's a really good general practice to get into. So I'm going to pop that first pin in, and you see there's my mesh. Now you won't see it if you don't have show mesh on, but like I said, I kind of recommend you doing that just so you kind of understand what's happening here. So you see the mesh, it's expanded 20 pixels outside of the edge of the artwork here, and you can see all the little triangles that'll allow it to deform and bend. So let's go ahead and keep putting in pins. Next one I'm going to put in is the elbow, and I'm going to look for where the artwork comes to these very subtle little pinches here right at the elbow, and I'm going to try to position that pin. Oops, that didn't get quite in the middle there. I want to be kind of in the middle of that artwork as best I can. Okay, and then down here I want to be right where that wrist join is there as well. And then I want to be right in the middle of the hand. So these are basically all joints. They're all places where things are going to bend. Except to a certain degree here, that's just a fixed position where that's going to rotate from. I want to be able to bend the fingers. Now, right now I can't bend the fingers because if I move this puppet pin around, you can see that what it's doing is it's moving the whole hand down the chain. I need something that flexes off of this point and can bend the fingers. So I have to put a final pin right at the tip of the fingers, even though that's not really a joint, but it allows me now to bend off of that point in the middle of the hand so I can bend the fingers. Now you're seeing as I'm doing this stuff that everything is kind of bending and flexing, and let's just take a minute for those of you unfamiliar with the puppet tool to see what's happening here. As I click and drag on these puppet pins, you can see it doesn't move in a very orderly way. I'm getting deformation, and I can sort of crudely pose things. Here, let me switch to my hand tool here, but you can see it's not very controlled. I can't really get it to pose very easily. Pretty rough if you're going to try to actually create character animation with a system like this. So the puppet tool is a great thing, and we're really glad that After Effects included it, but it's always been a little bit unfinished to a certain degree and a little bit useless on its own. Well, enter scripts like Duik, and there have been some others that do the basic thing we're going to do here, which is adding bones, which is Duik's term for this. But Duik does it as well as it doing a whole lot of other stuff. So I always recommend students just get Duik to do this. Duik is free and will do this for you very quickly. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to take these pins, and through Duik's script here, it's Bones script, Duik is going to write little expression code for us on each one of these pins, and it's going to generate a sequence of nulls, and it's going to parent through expression code each one of these pins to one of those nulls. That's going to make it possible for us to actually create some controlled movement. And that's why they call it bones, because it allows us to parent and then have things actually rotate against one another. Now, before we get much further here, I do want to mention a really important kind of big concept here. We've now added the puppet tool here, and you can see it comes up under Effects, Puppet. There's our mesh there. And when we added these pins and we added the puppet tool, a kind of significant thing has now happened, which is the position and rotation of this piece of artwork has now become, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but it has become virtually irrelevant. Because from now on, the puppet pins are going to control the position of this artwork. And that's a very significant thing to understand, is that as soon as you add those puppet pins, the puppet tool kind of takes over, and it becomes the thing that moves around and drives this artwork. So let's take a look at the pins we created, and we can do this very easily by selecting the layer where we added the pins and hitting the U key. And the reason why that works is because you can see as we added those pins, After Effects automatically makes a series of keyframes, position keyframes for these puppet pins. And as I said before, the puppet pins have no rotation value. They only have position value. There they are. So there are my pins, and you'll notice they're named very generically. So one of the first things we want to do, and this is really important, is we want to name our pins so that they have some kind of a consistent naming convention. Now, because I'm just rigging one arm here, I'm just going to do this very, very simply. When you're doing a more complex rig, you're going to need to come up with a more complex naming system. It's very important when you're rigging to not have objects that have the same name. You want kind of every layer and every object in your project to have a unique name. So we're going to make sure that each one of these pins has a unique name before we run the Duik script. So I'm going to go ahead and name these. I'll probably speed through it so that we can just save a little time here. Okay, so as you can see, I just named these very sensibly. I try to name things as close to what they really are as possible. So we have the shoulder, the elbow, wrist. So you notice I name them after joints rather than the body parts. That generally works better for me. Now with the hand, I revert to just hand and fingers because I'm not really sure. I guess you could say knuckles and fingers or something. But generally, I try to stick to kind of naming joints, naming puppet pins after joints, because generally that's what they are. They're a pivot point, so they are a joint rather than, say, upper arm, lower arm. I tend to name artwork of an upper arm or the artwork of the lower arm. I'll name that upper arm, lower arm, but the joint is named after the joint, elbow, wrist. Makes more sense to me there. Again, this is all kind of personal preference stuff to some degree, but it's about being organized and making sure that what you name things make sense. Okay, now that we have those named, I can now run my Duik script. And this is super cool. This works really fast and easy. So I just select my layer where my puppet pins are placed, and I just click Bones on Duik. And you can see what's happened here is it's added a series of nulls, and it has named them the same thing I named them. That's why it's important to name these. And you want to do this ahead of time. So you want to name this, add the bones to them, and now you can see Duik has named it, and it's just added a B underscore for bone for each one of these. So what's significant about this is that now we have the puppet tool, the puppet pins controlling the artwork, but now we have null objects controlling our puppet pins. And this is awesome. I'm going to go ahead and just lock this layer now, because now we can just do standard parenting here. So I'm going to open my parenting column here. I usually keep this closed for animation to save on real estate. And now I can parent these up like a normal FK chain, layer by layer, wrist to elbow, elbow to shoulder, okay? And what's cool here now is now I have a rotation value plus I have parenting. So now I can create the sense of there being bones inside this arm, because I'm pivoting and have these elements parented together. That's why they call it bones, okay? And really it's just nulls. It's just parenting nulls to puppet pins with expressions. But honest to God, this basically makes the puppet tool palatable, because now you can do anything that you do with any normal layer. And you can add other scripts and expressions, and you can parent, and you can do all the kinds of things that you would do with an ordinary layer. So this is really a terrific thing. And that includes adding an IK chain using Duik again. So let's go ahead and build that IK chain now, and then we'll finish up our simple rig here. Now the IK chain in Duik 14 always begins with an FK chain. You have to have an FK chain with the correct parenting already built. And the Duik IK works over 3 layers, from the bottom of the chain to the top of the chain, over 3 layers. The hand and fingers also need to be parented in, however, because they will become part of this rig. So we want to make sure we have a clear FK chain marching up this whole chain from the fingers to the hand, hand to the wrist, elbow, and shoulder. But our IK chain is going to be built on these 3 layers, wrist, elbow, and shoulder. Now, before we build this, we also need a controller, something to click and drag to control our arm. So we're going to make a controller using, again, a nice little quick Duik script here. And we want our controller to be anchored off of the same anchor point that the wrist is. So I'm going to select the wrist, and I'm going to hit the controller button on Duik, and all that does is very simple, is it just makes a null at the same anchor point as the anchor point you have selected, and you can see it renames it with the same name and just throws a C underscore for controller. Now we're going to rename this and manipulate this a little bit. That script, by the way, doesn't do anything else. It doesn't add any other code or anything. It just simply pops in a null right at that anchor point. But it's really nice and fast and useful. So I'm going to rename that null. Whoops. I'm going to rename that null, and I'm going to call it something like what this really is. We can call it, we'll just call it left hand. And I always like to kind of name the controller something very easy and obvious and easy to read, and because this is what the operator or the animator will actually see. That's what they will actually be looking at. Now the other thing I want to do is I want to make it bigger so it's easier to grab, and I want to kind of surround the hand to make it sort of intuitive, to give it sort of a comfortable feeling. And so I'm going to make the size of this null about 150 wide there. Well, that's maybe too much. Let's go for about 100. And we'll make it just a little bit longer since Dolly's hand is a little bit longer there. So we have a little bit of a rectangle. And then I'm going to adjust the anchor point to bring it down. And I'm going to try something kind of regular, like maybe 25. That looks pretty good. Maybe 20. There, that looks pretty good. And again, I'm trying to get it to kind of surround the hand in a sort of intuitive kind of a way. There, maybe 15 is a little bit better. There we go. And that gives me a nice thing that I can click and drag on and move around there. So that gives me my controller, and that's all ready to go. Now we can actually build our IK chain using, again, the Duik script. And thankfully, this is a pretty easy process. So when you create a Duik IK chain in Duik 14, you start with the bottom of the chain and you work up to the top of the chain, and then the last thing you select is the controller. That tells Duik what you're trying to do. So remember, have your parenting in place first, and we're going to go wrist, elbow, shoulder, and then controller. Then we're going to hit the IK button, boom, and that's going to give us the IK options. Now, the first option we want to look at is the orientation. This is indicated by these little greater and less than symbols, and they're meant to just visually indicate what direction the elbow will default to bending. And in other words, he'll have your ability to switch your orientation. Like you do with all the Duik IK systems, you can switch it, but this will indicate what is the default. In other words, when the IK orientation is switched on, what will it be? Now, in this case, we want the elbow to bend this way, so this is our correct choice. So I'm going to leave that checked on. Now, because we are doing just a simple rig here, I'm going to turn off the FK-IK switch. I'm going to turn that off. That's what that is here. That gives you that ability to turn the FK and the IK on and off. Now you can absolutely leave that on, and then you'll get all those FK controls and the switcher. I'm just going to leave that off just for simplicity, but you can leave that on if you want. Then, because I'm using a puppet tool rig, I'm going to leave stretch controls on because I want it to be able to stretch. That allows it to stretch. If you don't check that, you won't get the stretching. It won't be included in there. So we'll leave that on. And then I'm going to hit OK. Boom. Now, seems like nothing very exciting has happened, but if we select our controller, you can see that our stretch and IK orientation controls have been added. Also, our goal control has been added. That's standard. And you can also see that if I pick and move around the controller, it is now controlling the arm correctly. So our IK chain is now built. But obviously we have some problems because this doesn't look super great here. Now again, if you want a curvy, soft, curved arm, you got it. There it is. It's already there. I'm going to show you guys how to make this a little more crisp and control it a little. And I think even in this case, even if you wanted the bendy arm, you'd probably at least want to make the wrist a little bit more crisp. But I do want to do a couple more things before we move completely on here. I want to do a little cleanup. One of the things I want to do is I want to zero out the position value of my new controller here. That way I never have to wonder where the neutral position is, this weird 503, 692. I'm never going to remember that in a million years, but I want to be able to return my arm to its neutral position. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, and I'm going to hit the 0 position button here on Duik, which simply creates a hidden null object that will now absorb that position value and replace our position value with zeros. Okay, now that that's done, now we can move our controller around without fear of losing our neutral. Okay. The other thing we want to do is we want to start right away. We want to start kind of keeping things clean a little bit. So I'm actually going to turn off the visibility of all of these nulls because we don't really need them to be visible. And I'm going to turn off my shy here for a minute. I'm going to go ahead and shy these as well because there's something else. I don't need to see these once I've got my rig finished. I also want to lock them because I also don't want them moving unless I move my controller, because remember, everything now is being driven by the controller and the position of the top null in the chain. And remember, that would then be parented into your torso or to an interim null for an auxiliary shoulder control. But the top of this chain is what gets parented into the rest of the body. So all that stuff, we can just lock all that stuff up. And then when I shy this, and we want to shy this guy here too. Then I have that situation now where I can't click on anything except this controller. And it's a good idea to get that, to start doing that in your process so you don't accidentally make any mistakes or mess something up. And I'll just give you guys a little warning here, a little heads up. One of the worst things you can do once you have your puppet pins in place, one of the worst things you can do is accidentally click and drag on the position of your artwork. And the reason for that is, if you recall, I talked about how now the puppet pins are now controlling the position of the art. If you move the artwork's position right now, the creepy thing is that you won't even notice anything happen because the artwork will stay in place because it is being controlled by the puppet pins now. So the puppet pins will hold it in place, but the artwork will actually be moved, and that can eventually cause some tremendous problems down the line. So it's a really good reason to kind of keep your layers locked while you're rigging, and then only unlock things when you absolutely need them. Okay, so we've got that cleanup done here, but we do actually need to do a little bit of work in these layers. So we'll just unlock them one at a time. So we want to do some starching here to start with. And we also need to add our finger control. Let's actually do that first before we do the starching. The finger control will allow us to bend the fingers, and we need to do is add that control to our main hand controller, because we don't want the animator to have to dig down through a bunch of layers in order to rotate the fingers. And let's just recall that the rotation of the fingers is controlled by the rotation of the hand null, which the fingers are parented to. So if I rotate that, it bends that little finger. It's bending a lot of other stuff too, but we'll fix that later. That is where we need to control the bend of the fingers, but we want that control centered in our visible clickable controllers. So let's add a control there. We're going to be using expression controls. So I'm going to select the layer I want the expression control added to, and I'm going to go up under Effects, Expression Controls, and we're going to add an angle control. And now that angle control appears on our controller. I'm going to hit the return key and name this fingers. And you would use the same procedure for any of the other expression controls: angle, checkbox, layer control, point control, and slider control. Those are the ones that are frequently used in rigging. Color control is less used in rigging. 3D point control has to do with 3D rigging. That's another big giant topic. I'm not going to touch on that, but for kind of standard rigging, angle, point and slider control, and occasionally layer control come into play. Now what we want to do is move this to the top, because it's probably something we're going to use more often than we're going to use these other controls. And then I'm going to lock my effect control window. By locking that, that means I can now select other layers without this changing to the effects controls on these layers. So I've locked that window, so this will now stay put. Now I can go to this rotation value, and now we can add an expression to control this value with the value of this angle control. Now we don't require any fancy code here because this is just a one-to-one relationship of degrees to degrees. So we don't have to do anything fancy, and we can simply use the pick whip in order to connect these. So I'm going to go to this rotation value, and I'm going to option click to activate expression. And then I'm going to grab the pick whip, expression pick whip, and I'm going to click and drag and select this angle control for the fingers. Boom. And now this angle control now controls the bend of my fingers from my controller. Super cool. And this is how we create a lot of our rigging, is by adding the expression controls and then connecting attributes to those expression controls. However, in other cases, sliders and so forth, you need a little bit more math to get this to work and a little bit more code. But for rotation values, it's super easy. You can just tie those suckers right together directly. So let's go ahead and close that up, and I'm going to lock that again because I don't need to be mucking around in there anymore. But now we want to try to get this arm to look a little bit less rubbery. Let's pretend we don't want so much rubberiness. And so what we want to do is we need to add starch to our puppet tool. And starch is a particular tool within the puppet tool system that basically allows you to add stiffness to the puppet mesh so that certain parts of the puppet mesh don't bend and flex so softly. This has some very, very crude parallels to weight painting in 3D rigging, but the analogy doesn't go very far. This is a pretty crude tool, and it requires some adjustments to work correctly. So I'm going to select the artwork layer that our mesh is on, and I want to actually select the mesh itself. And then I'm going to select, if I haven't already, my puppet starch tool, and you can see the edge of the mesh appear there. Now, here's the thing. Your default settings are going to be probably different than mine here. The first default setting that you want to change is the amount. I believe the default starts at 15%. Now you may be saying to yourself, 15% doesn't sound very much on a scale of 0 to 100. However, for some strange reason, in the world of the starch tool, 15 is like a crazy, wacky, crazy amount of starch. It's like so much starch. And I don't really know why After Effects programmed this. I think the puppet tool is still a pretty weird, oddball little item, frankly. So generally, I start everything at 1% amount, 1% of starch. And I rarely have ever, in fact, I will go farther. I have never had to go higher than 1, and sometimes I go lower than 1 to 0.5 or 0.25 or 75. So 1 is usually sufficient for most circumstances. All right, let's start down at the bottom with the fingers here. And the first thing I want to do is I want the fingers to not bend so with such curvature. I want it to bend crisply right at the knuckle here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to starch the fingers and the top part of the hand, but I'm going to leave the area right around the joint soft. That way there's an area of softness to bend, but stiff areas that will feel more structured. So I'm going to start with just a squirt kind of, and I'm looking at this whole area. I want to pay attention to the edges of the whole mesh. I want to basically fill this whole area right about here. So I'm going to squirt somewhere right about there. And you can see the extent is a little too far. So I'm just going to click and drag down on the extent until I get closer to what I want. And then I can come in and click and drag this little red point. That's my starch point there. And I can get this so it's covering those fingers, but it is leaving the area of bending open. Okay, so now I'm going to add a little more starch to the hand. And that's once again way too much. We're going to pull that back. And I'm going to pull this back up a little bit. I don't mind if it encroaches on the wrist a teeny bit. That's not a problem. But I do want to leave this area in the middle here to get a nice soft bend right in the middle. And that'll keep the flexing where we want it and keep these stiffer. And you should be able to see right away that we have an improved situation here. You can see that now it bends cleanly. Also notice that it's doing far less crazy deformation on the upper part of the arm. Okay, and we're getting a nice crisp bend right where we want it there. So that's feeling a lot better. Now the other thing about this is we could stop right here. If I pick up now and move this controller, you can see I've got a little bit of a stiffer wrist here, but I'm still getting that nice bendy flexy arm. And you may like this. This may be the most appropriate look for your character. So you could be done right now. You could say, that's it. That's all I want. I just want this fun, bendy kind of noodle arm. And that is absolutely a choice that you can make. So let's just return this to neutral here. But I'm going to go ahead and continue with the starching so you can see the process. And let's go ahead and try to make this much crisper. So I'm going to grab that starch tool again, and I've selected my mesh. And let's continue up and get the forearm and the upper arm to be more stiff. Now with the forearm, I want starch from just above where the wrist is bending to just below where the elbow bends. So I'm going to squirt right in the middle there, and then I'm going to spread it out, and then we're going to kind of move around this red point until we get kind of an even spread between the two. Now I don't want to encroach too much. That's probably close enough there. We'll test it in a little bit. And then I want to come up and do the same here. Now here, I want starch to cover the whole end all the way down. The only thing I want to bend is this little bit right here, because this part has no, this part has no reason for bending. So I'm going to click about here, and then we're going to crank up on this extent again and really just fill that in, maybe to about right there. Okay, now let's go ahead and test this a little bit. So I'm going to pick this up and move it, and there we have a nice, crisp, more of a feeling of skeletal structure and bones. So you'll notice we've got this little kind of ugly bend here that we had before. I'll show you a little trick that'll fix this a little bit. Now the truth is there's really no complete way around this issue. But we can improve on it a little bit. So I'm going to actually, with this controller picked up and moved a little bit and the bend visible, I'm going to go back to the mesh. I'm going to select the mesh, and I'm going to go back to my starch tool. Now this seems a little weird because we're now seeing the mesh straight even though it's actually bent. But don't let that throw you. Any change we make here is going to be reflected in the bent arm, and this just allows us to see the effect we're having. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to squirt a very small amount of starch, and let's bring it way down, just right in the middle of that little elbow there. And you can see that it kind of plumps up that elbow a little bit and makes it a little bit less pinchy. And I'll even delete it here quickly so that you can see what it's doing. So look at the arm bend there, and if I click on that little guy and delete it, you can see it didn't make a huge big difference, but you can see it got a little bit more pinchy right there. So let's maybe even add a little bit more. Okay, see how that plumped that out a little? There we go. That is working a little better. I'm going to try to get this a little cleaner shape around those triangles there. There, that's looking a little bit better. So let's make sure we haven't completely lost our crisp joint there. No, but you can see that's maintaining its volume a little bit better. So starch can have a variety of uses and can allow us to get this kind of crisp look. It can also fix some of that kind of pinchy kind of stuff that we're running into occasionally. Okay, this is working pretty well. We're getting a pretty decent deformation from this little rig here. So let's reset our neutrals. Let's set this guy back, and let's go ahead and finish up the cleanup of this little rig. We're pretty much there, but we just want to kind of put the finishing touches on this little rig. So I'm going to close this guy up and lock that. We want to make sure, once again, that the only thing that is visible aside from the background elements is the ARM artwork and the controller itself. We want everything locked except the controller, and we want everything shied except the controller. And then now when we click the shy button there, we now have this nice clean interface where the only thing that we can click and drag is that controller. Now, maybe the last thing that we might want to do is actually add some keyframes at these neutral positions. And we might want to add the fingers in and anything else that we might use, maybe the IK orientation. And then now I have my little set of neutral keyframes, and I can select those, Command Option click to turn those into holds. Okay, now we're almost ready. Couple last little baby things we want to do. One thing that happens sometimes with clicking and dragging on these nulls is that you can sometimes accidentally click and drag and scale rather than move it around. And for the animator, this can be crazy frustrating. So I like to do a little trick with an expression code here to make that impossible. And so I'm going to hit the S key here to open the scale attribute, and then I'm going to option click on the stopwatch to activate expressions. And then I'm just going to type in bracket 100 comma 100 bracket, and that's just going to tell the scale value that this is all it can be. It can only be that. The scale value is this, period. So now this value is no longer adjustable, and now no matter how hard I try to click on these little edges, all I can do is pick it up and move it around. So that's a pretty nice trick, and it's one of those just really nice animator friendly details that you want to put in. And then the very last thing that I like to do is to hide the parent column. That just gives you a lot more screen real estate for your keyframes in your timeline. So there you have it, a nice, simple little arm rig there. Again, rigging is a big, deep, wide ocean, and this is barely brushing against the surface with a feather here, but at least gives you an idea of some basic rigging that you can try yourself and how these rigs work. Keep your eye on School of Motion for the in-depth rigging course that we're planning to release soon.